Hello and welcome to another edition of Another Book Review. This week I'll be reviewing David Halberstam's book, The Fifties. Unfortunately, I don't have a cover to share with you. I'll go over the author, what the book is about, talk about what I liked about it, what I didn't like about it, and finish off with what I'll be reviewing for next time. David Halberstam is a very famous historian, started writing really back in the 1960s. Wrote probably about 24 books in his career, won the Pulitzer Prize. Um, Probably is best known for this book. He also wrote a book on the Korean War called The Coldest Winter that I've yet to read. He also wrote a book called The Breaks of the Game about basketball. Also wrote a book on Michael Jordan. So he's very eclectic in his works. This book, The Fifties, is exactly that. It's a examination of the 1950s that he wrote in the early 1990s. And it covers roughly the time from Harry Truman beating Dewey and up to the election of John F. Kennedy, roughly is when the timeline of the book. So most of the book is really Eisenhower's presidency, Eisenhower dealing with the pressure from the Democrats to increase the military budget, the Soviet Union by dealing with the CIA and their incursions into the Soviet Union, the Korean War, the change in the culture of the 1950s, be it rock and roll, be it the civil rights movement, be it the explosion of television and consumer spending after what was the Great Depression and the Second World War. So it's done really, really well. The one thing I would highly recommend it, based on this alone, I would say if you're interested at all in history and you don't know very much about this period, the book is very, very, very readable. David Halberstam has this ability to mix high-level stories and kind of on-the-ground action in really a seamless way. His stories, his parts on the civil rights movement, I thought were really, really good, where he's going back years later and interviewing people who were there and getting their takes. And so he does this very good job of mixing kind of the moment and the human, I think, really, really well. The book moves at a relatively good pace considering how long the book is. He interviewed a lot of sources, like I mentioned, that he mentions at the end of the book, a lot of different people. Yeah, and I think the book is, I would say, a consensus history. And so if you're someone who wants more of the um, counter arguments, counterfactuals, well, David, you're saying this, what about this? This is not really the book then for you. I think he does a good job of having summations of things and then kind of moving on. And so if you want really he had a chapter on Marilyn Monroe and the rise of Playboy. And if you want something that's more about, a feminist critique of that, then it's not really that book. It's really, I think, very similar in some ways to what Chuck Klosterman was doing with the 90s, which I reviewed earlier. I'll put that review below after the video. What he was trying to do there, I think, is what Halberstam did here, is trying to give basically a consensus, what most people believed at the time to be true. And so it's just a really interesting book. It talks about Peyton Place, which was a very famous novel at the time, the kind of rise of conformity in America, the kind of somewhat closing of the Overton window. But it was just fascinating because it's a very, very different world than we live in today, obviously, and seeing kind of those tensions and contradictions and differences I just thought was really interesting. If I was going to critique it for anything, I think any time that you have a book this large, I read it on ebook, and my ebook was like 310 pages, so I imagine it was probably closer to like 600 or 700 pages. It's a lot. It's like 40 chapters. Most chapters move at a pretty good clip, but there are some chapters that you maybe could have cut. I don't know if you really needed to have a chapter on Ozzie and Harriet Nelson. I think there's a chapter on, I believe, Richard Allen or Robert Allen, who was a comedian from radio who tried to make it into TV and it didn't work. There's maybe a couple chapters you could have cut there. There's maybe one or two chapters towards the end about GM that you probably could have cut, about the rise of the VW Beetle as a challenger to GM, which at the time was like the world's largest corporation. It was just making money hand over fist. So there's some choices that he made that maybe for the sake of time and maybe brevity I may have eliminated. Each of the chapters itself, I think it's really, really good at what it does, and it's kind of pushing forward the major events, and I think it's very well organized. It follows a rough chronology of the decade, and I don't think there's too much where he really lingers longer than is deserved. There's a chapter on Oppenheimer and Teller and all that, and that kind of, there's a chapter on Werner von Braun, and so I think all the bases are covered. And if you're just looking for one large historical book on the 1950s, I think you could do a lot worse than this. And I think everybody, to the point too, I think everybody's going to say some things of like, well, why was this not included? I don't think there's a lot of mention of Eisenhower's building of the federal highway system, which I think is to me like one of the crowning achievements of his presidency when I think of what he's done. And I don't think that's in the book or not mentioned in that way of just how that got passed and why. Um, yeah, it's mostly the international stuff is mostly about the Soviet Union and America's relationship to the Soviet Union after the Second World War, and understanding what was happening there and how that related to Korea. I thought was good stuff. How oftentimes the American government confuses nationalism with communism, and how that is a recurring theme throughout history, and setting up really the Vietnam War later. And so I think he does a really good job of writing from a high level of making you understand why this was important, and also giving you really the emotions behind the people. He oftentimes dives into personal lives of people when it's relevant, and I think that really was a humanizing touch of his that I think is missing from a lot of histories that I read. I think are really useful to kind of give you a fuller perspective of why someone was doing what he's doing. There's a quiz show. There's a chapter on quiz show and the quiz show scandal that maybe I think could have been cut as well. That kind of goes on for a little longer than I think is necessary. Is I think the point he's making is just kind of how television was such a brand new thing that there was an innocence to it, and some of that innocence kind of went away when that happened. There's the McCarthy trials. He has a pretty long section on that. So I think there is something here for everybody. If you have a certain interest in the 1950s, I think he hits on it. Again, there's probably some blind spots that I'm not thinking of, but high level, I thought it was worth reading. If you wanted to read histories at all, any kind of interest in this period, I would recommend checking it out. I was back and forth on whether or not I'm going to review it, but I think I will. I also read The Age of Grievance by Frank Brunei, and I will review that for next time. Like I said below, I will leave the link to the Chuck Klosterman video for the 90s. This is the difference between Klosterman and David Halberstam too is Halberstam is very direct, wears his heart on his sleeve, is not a fan of irony in any shape or form. He just hears the story, and that was a nice change of pace too. But until next time, if you liked the video, please subscribe to the channel. Hit the like button if you've enjoyed this. Feel free to leave a comment below if you have read this book and what your feelings on it were. If there's anything you think Halberstam did miss, it's a huge book, and there's sure there to be blind spots. Yeah, so feel free to leave that there. Until next time, bye.